Hello, my name's Elizabeth. I'm a bookseller and a book buyer and a book reader. And today, let's talk about some books that I read. If you've been here before, you know that I like to talk about these books 5 at a time. And the first one in this lot is Seven Wonders of the Ancient World by Bettany Hughes. Isn't this cover gorgeous? That is 100% the reason that this caught my eye. And then I saw that it was blurbed on that side, Stephen Fry, who said, "A wondrous, wonderful achievement." And the other blurb is Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's an actual historian. This fascinating book is brimming with stories. This, as you can guess, is about the wonders of the ancient world. Call number is 930.1, which is archaeology, which tracks because only one of the ancient wonders is still standing. This, I had such a good time. It goes through each of the wonders in order of their age. So it starts with the pyramids, which I found fascinating that the oldest one is also the one still standing. It goes through the ancient wonders. If you're not familiar with them, we have the Great Pyramids at Giza, then the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which may or may not have existed. There's evidence either way. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Pharos Lighthouse at Alexandria. And it goes through the cultural context for the building of each of those wonders, the actual building of the wonders, who financed it and why, the impact that it had on the world and the evidence that we have of how people viewed it and wrote about it and thought about it. And then the destruction of all of them, except obviously the pyramids. And just a really good time, really well, accessible language, really well researched. This is not a period of time that I know anything about. My expertise is medieval history, and this is well before then. But really an accessible and interesting read. There's a little bit of author in here, and I think authors are encouraged to put themselves in the narrative of a nonfiction work, which sometimes I find, if you've been here, I find that so annoying. I will not read that. But in this one, it's more about the authors, and she's an archaeologist, her impressions of climbing around inside the pyramids, or what it's like to walk about the sites that you can still see the ruins of these things, or the impressions of why a wonder was built on a particular site because of, the view or the location or whatever. What it would have been like to walk to a site, because of course you would have walked, and the terrain, which is different but not that different. One thing that I did learn from this, which was wild to me, and if you know, well then it won't be a shock to you, but when the pyramids were built, it was grass. It was on grass. That is wild. Obviously, it is millennia. The axis of the earth has tilted since then, and that has caused the area where the pyramids are now to be desert, not grass, which is so cool. I love that. Scary. But, I'm not a environmental historian or a geologist or anything like that. So that's new knowledge to me, and I found it fascinating. Anyway, the cover did get me, but the insides were really nice too. Next up, we have Judith Flanders, Rites of Passage, Death and Mourning in Victorian Britain. I had to read this one because it's grief culture, which I love. Also, a bit of shiny gold foiling happening. Judith Flanders is a historian of Victorian Britain, so it's not a shock that she wrote this one. And it does what it says on the tin. It is about death and mourning in Victorian Britain. So when we talk about death, it's how people think about death, write about death, perceive death in their everyday lives, how death was, and we all know this, how death was more intimate and immediate and in your face. People were laid out in their homes before funerals, not like today where everybody's whisked away and we don't have to think about it. Oh, I didn't say the call number here is 393, which is death customs. So we have chapters here: the sick room, the deathbed, from churchyard to cemetery, before the funeral, different types of funeral, mourning dress, mourning customs, different types of death, like unnatural deaths or criminal deaths, the way that death was written about in literature. So we have Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up, and then there's lots about Queen Victoria's diaries and how she was just obsessed with death after the death of Albert. So super interesting to read. Sometimes I struggled with it simply because of the subject matter. It is talking about death and grief, and sometimes I found that a bit overwhelming and I had to put it down, which I think is completely understandable. But there was one bit in here that I want to read to you because it was just fascinating. So this section is talking about the cost of funerals. There was a household management book called Cassell's Household Guide, which presented a £53 funeral as standard for the middle class. Now, £53 in 1870s is about £8,000 today, which is nearly 15,000 Australian. I don't know. You can do the maths on your currency. $15,000 for a funeral is ridiculous, but this is what you get, which I don't think you get for $15,000 today. 4 horses to pull the hearse, 2 mourning coaches for the family, each also pulled by 4 horses, 2 dozen ostrich feathers and velvet coverings for the horses and coaches, a featherman, a double coffin lined with superfine cambric and with brass coffin furniture, the use of a silk pall, 2 mutes wearing hats with black streamers, black sashes across their chests, and with staves tied with black ribbons, silk gloves and hatbands for the mourners, 14 pages, and all attendants dressed in full mourning. That seems like a bargain for $15,000, and I want that. Sell the book collection, maybe. Anyway, that is a huge funeral, even though it's presented as the average for middle class. That's really aspirational, like you would get in a magazine today, where a $1,000 dress is reasonable. It's absolutely not reasonable for a normal person. And this is at the end of like that highly formal culture as well. So we go from something super formal like that, more casual over the years, spending less money on it because there's better things to spend your money on, I guess. It was also the case where mourning coaches, and we're talking mourning, mourning, were sent to pick people up to attend funerals, and it often became the case where those coaches would be empty. There's in Bleak House, there's a funeral that happens where only 3 people attend the funeral and the rest of the coaches are empty, and they're in the procession but nobody's inside them. You still have to pay for that, for appearances, even if nobody bothers to turn up. Anyway, if you are interested in death culture or Victorian Britain, I would highly recommend, and now I have a couple more from Judith Flanders on my wish list because it was really readable, really interesting, and Victorian Britain is something that I know about mostly from literature, not from reading nonfiction, so expand my knowledge, I guess. Next up is one that I read on Kindle, and that was Satantango by László Krasznahorkai. Now, I picked this up because Krasznahorkai won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year, and Satantango is basically his most accessible work. He also won the Man Booker International Prize when it was called that, when it was awarded to an author, not a book, in 2015. This one was written in 1985 and published in English in 2013, and it took about 10 years to translate. It is dense, and the part where it's his most accessible work does say something. And probably why it's won these awards, because the more dense and impenetrable the work, the more likely it is to be awarded something like a Booker Prize, because I feel like things like the Booker Prize is awarded to dense literature, impenetrable literature, because the judges feel like they should be smart enough to understand what is happening, and they don't, therefore it must be a clever work. Is that my bias towards the Booker in particular? Yes. László Krasznahorkai is a Hungarian author, and this is set in Hungary. communist Hungary in the 50s, I think. It is a group of people living in a very poor, failed commune situation, and they call it the estate, and it's clearly failing, and everyone who can leave has left. And so there's these guys, these people who have remained simply because they can't or won't leave. And so they're living their miserable lives. This whole book is set over the course of a day and a night. I think couple of days, couple of nights. Is raining the entire time, and it is just dark and miserable. And they're living their miserable lives in their miserable little failed estate. And someone who did live there and left has come back. Is he a con man? Like, he's giving Lyle Lanley, come to sell the monorail to the town, and they all buy it and they believe in him. And then what happens after that? One of the interesting things about the structure of this story, it's a postmodernist story. Each chapter is a single paragraph. And when I say that, like, it's pages and pages without a line break. You really have to lock in with this one. And in the form of a tango, it takes 6 steps forward and then 6 steps back. And so we're starting at the end and we're ending at the start. And it is a complicated tango. This one I read as a buddy read with Luke, who I often buddy read with. And so I'm going to link Luke's review as well. But together we were both like, what the fuck is happening? This was excellent. So I don't know if that's an indication to you if you want to pick it up. Like I said, it was dense and it was hard and rewarding when you got to the end, but also what the fuck? What the fuck just happened? So I'm beginning to really enjoy that. Maybe that's a pattern for my 2026 reading so far, is reading things where I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what I was supposed to get out of the book. And then I'm like, let's go again. And this was the start of it for 2026. Would I recommend? I don't know. Weird, but like in the good way. But like I said, it's dark and it's raining the whole time. So you've got to be well prepared for a miserable shit show of a time. Is that an endorsement? I don't know. And then after that, something lighter, I read The Churn, which is a novella by James S.A. Corey, set in the world of The Expanse. And it's actually set as like a prequel to everything else. The churn is something that one of the characters, Amos, talks about a lot. The churn is when your whole life is hang on, let's do English properly. So the churn is when your whole life is turned upside down. Things change, things out of your control change. And do you roll with the punches or do you fail? And you have no control over that. So you just have to go with the churn. And that is Amos's attitude to life, because he had an incredibly traumatic childhood, some of which is touched on in this book. So this is Amos just before he leaves Earth, grows up on Earth. He grows up as an undocumented person, so his birth isn't registered. And so he's not eligible for benefits on Earth. In the world of The Expanse, people live on basic, which is universal basic income. And they're given basic because there are literally no jobs and no opportunities for them. You have to fight to get an education. You have to prove that you're worth an education. And Amos, as an undocumented person, doesn't have access to any of that anyway. So he falls in with the mob and a little gang. And because of his childhood trauma, he is coded autistic. He has to perform empathy because he doesn't inherently have that. And so he's watching other people and taking their cues on how to behave. He's with a friend of his called Eric, and they together are part of this gang, and don't need to go into the particulars. But by the end of it, things happen where he becomes Amos. His name is not Amos. But that's the identity that he assumes, and he gets off Earth and he gets an education, and then he becomes the Amos that we know in The Expanse. So this is backstory for him, and it's an interesting story anyway. They all are. This one I picked up because the next installment of The Expanse that I'm rereading does delve into everybody's backstory. This one is also probably the longest of the novellas that are in between the main books of The Expanse. It felt like a really chunky story, but you don't need to read these interspersed series to understand the story as a whole. It's just, you know, a bit more depth, a bit more layers. And also, we love Amos, of course. And then after the Churn, I read The Vital Abyss, which is another short story in this universe, and it sits between the two books that I was up to in my Expanse reread. This will be spoilers, but only mild spoilers, so don't stress. This follows a character called Cortazar, who worked for a company called Protogen, who was working on the protomolecule. And Cortazar and the scientists that he was working with are captured in one of the earlier books, and they're held in prison in an indeterminate place for an indeterminate length of time. And it is all from Cortazar's point of view about the experience of being held captive. But Cortazar and some of his fellow scientists have undergone a treatment to remove the empathy, basically. So the same thing that's happened to Amos, but scientifically and deliberately removing this empathy so that they can do things like human trials without feeling bad about it. And so it's Cortazar's experience of being held captive, but without that emotional impact of being held captive. It's just the physical impact. And the way that he lives and survives and ultimately escapes, doesn't escape, but he's removed from prison for purposes that become clear later in the series, which I'm not going to spoil. And so this one it's just really, it's contained in one room. We don't know how many days it's set over, and it's really claustrophobic, and also just world building, not just what happens to Cortazar, because it's interesting to have the story of what happened to him in between where we see him in the main storyline, but also a bit more world building of Earth. Cortazar is from Earth, did get an education, and did come up as a documented resident, and how that is different from the other people that we know from Earth, which is Holden and Amos. Both these short stories, the Churn and the Vital Abyss, and all the other short stories, are collected in a collection called Memories Legion. So if you want access to them reading The Expanse, you can grab that and read them in between the stories when they were published, or read them at the end, and it will just broaden your view if you are as obsessed with The Expanse as I am, which you should be. Okay, that was 5 books that I read and enjoyed, and some of them were weird and some of them were good, and actually I recommend all of them except like Satantango. You've got to be really keen, but the rest of them fully recommend. The name and links to these books will all be down below, and I'll be back to talk about more books soon.